Let's start with a system anomaly. It's 1980. We have two economies at the starting line. The Republic of Korea, its labor force operating at just 20% of U.S. productivity. And then there's Brazil, seemingly twice as far ahead at 40%. Now, every standard economic model would have predicted their paths would converge. But that's not what happened. The system glitched.
Fast forward 4 decades, the code executed, and the results were brutal. Korea's productivity didn't just grow, it tripled, rocketing past 60%. Meanwhile, Brazil's trajectory buckled, it stalled, and then it went into reverse, collapsing to just 25%. You have to understand, this isn't just a statistical fluke. This is a fundamental divergence that reveals a deep, often ignored truth about how progress actually works.
And here's the truth this divergence exposes. National progress isn't a hardware problem, it's a software problem. The decisive factor isn't the pile of physical assets, the roads, the factories, the machinery. It's the quality of the nation's underlying operating system. It's the invisible code that dictates how its people trust each other, how they innovate, and critically, what they dare to aspire to.
This brings us to the villain of the story. It's a cognitive trap, a deeply embedded fallacy that holds entire economies hostage. We call it the hardware-first fallacy. It's the seductive, comforting, and entirely false premise that if you just accumulate enough capital, pour enough concrete, build enough factories, prosperity will automatically follow.
This fallacy is the chief architect of what economists call the middle income trap. And this isn't just about sluggish growth. It's more like a gravitational well, a state of economic purgatory that traps developing nations in a permanent game of catch-up, forever chasing a horizon that's moving away faster than they can run.
The data makes the failure of this hardware model undeniable. I mean, look at this. If physical capital was all that mattered, a worker in a typical middle-income country should be about 3/4 as productive as an American one. But the reality? They're barely at 20%. The model doesn't just bend here, it shatters. There is a massive performance gap that the hardware simply cannot explain.
This is the strategy that the hardware fallacy produces, the legacy playbook, the one-eye strategy for pure investment. It seems so logical, so linear: accelerate investment, build infrastructure, and then wait for growth. It's the path of least resistance, and that's precisely what makes it so dangerous. It's an operating system that works just well enough to get you out of poverty, but it's designed to crash the moment it hits real complexity.
So if it's not the hardware, what is it? To really understand what drives economic escape velocity, we have to look past the physical assets and analyze the system's foundational code. We have to go down to the kernel level of this software. And that social kernel runs on one protocol above all others: trust. For a perfect example of this, just look at the rise of Shenzhen's tech ecosystem. This was not a centrally planned miracle. It was an emergent, self-organizing system built by waves of migration from different ethnic groups. Each group, bound by deep internal trust networks, colonized and then optimized a specific part of the value chain. First came the Fujianese, taking on the risk of producing stable components. Then, after 2006, the Wenzhou arrived, bringing more cautious capital for systems integration.
What resulted was a hyper-efficient, decentralized production network that ran on the high-bandwidth connection of social trust. It radically compressed the time it took to get a product to market because you didn't need complex legal contracts for every transaction. Deals were sealed on a handshake. This allowed for a speed of iteration that formal, low-trust systems could never dream of matching. The Kaoshan handled components, the Hunan drove the R&D, and the whole thing became an economic engine built on a cultural foundation, not a capital one.
Now, this kernel-level code, this cultural software, has huge consequences. It actually determines the type of innovation a society is optimized to produce. Cultures that reward individualism, for example, tend to create environments ripe for radical, frame-breaking ideas. They value novelty. Collectivist cultures, on the other hand, often prioritize usefulness and benefit to the group. Their systems become optimized for efficient integration and rapid, incremental improvements, which is exactly the engine that powered Shenzhen. Okay, so a high-trust social kernel is crucial. But even the most powerful kernel is completely useless without a functioning user interface. This brings us to the second, and maybe even more critical layer of the software, the aspiration layer. This is the human interface. It's what determines whether a system's potential can ever actually be unlocked. The insight here is really profound, and it's a two-way street. It's not just that poverty blocks your opportunities. It's that poverty systematically attacks your psychological capacity to even see those opportunities in the first place. When your social environment constantly narrows your vision of what's possible, the system itself suffers a catastrophic failure. And let's be absolutely clear about this. Aspiration failure is not an individual failing. It's not a personal weakness. It is a systemic condition. It's an erosion of ambition that's engineered by an environment of scarcity and constraint. Think of it as a bug in the societal software that degrades the system's most vital resource, human potential.
And this bug creates the system's most vicious feedback loop. Poverty weakens the capacity to aspire. That, in turn, leads to behaviors like extreme risk aversion or a focus on only the short term. And those behaviors, of course, just reinforce the initial state of poverty. This loop locks individuals, communities, and eventually whole nations into a state of low-level equilibrium. A fantastic economic OS with a broken UI cannot function. Period.
So, if the villain is the hardware first model and its traps, then what's the hero? Well, the hero isn't a single policy or some magic bullet. The hero is a process. It is a deliberate, actionable strategy for architecting a systemic software upgrade. The path to escape this trap requires two very conscious, very sequential upgrades. First, a nation has to move from the simple 1I of investment to 2I. That means adding the deliberate infusion of foreign technology. This is about mastering the art of imitation and adaptation. Then, once that's mastered, comes the second upgrade, to 3I. That's when you add native innovation to the stack, building the capacity not just to use global tech, but to contribute to it, and eventually, to lead.
And this framework brings us right back to that opening mystery, Korea versus Brazil. Now we can see the code behind the crash. Korea executed this sequence perfectly. It became a master of the 2I strategy, infusing foreign tech to build global champions before it methodically built its own 3I innovation engine. Brazil, on the other hand, tried to leapfrog. It jumped straight from 1I to 3I, pumping subsidies into domestic innovation while completely bypassing the crucial infusion stage. The result? A flood of worthless patents, falling wages for skilled workers, and a system crash that froze this productivity for a generation.
So what's the playbook for actually executing this upgrade? It's a process of controlled demolition. It requires actively managing the forces of creative destruction through three core actions. 1, you have to discipline incumbents. You enforce brutal competition to stop entrenched elites from protecting the past at the expense of the future. 2, you allocate talent purely by merit. You have to systematically break down social barriers to get the best people working on the hardest problems. And 3, you have to capitalize on crisis. You weaponize external shocks to shatter legacy structures and force through painful but necessary change.
And you know, this framework doesn't just apply to nations, it applies to industries, to companies, to any complex system that's facing change. And so the fundamental question it leaves us with is a test of your system's source code. Is it architected for evolution, designed to adapt, or is it hard-coded with legacy instructions, optimized only to protect the past? The answer to that question determines everything. It determines whether you break out or whether you stay trapped.